Okay, so as mentioned, units to be activated must be in supply, and the HQ activating the units must also be in supply. What does this mean? For the units, it means that it has to be within range of an HQ that can activate the unit and also be able to trace a legal supply path to the headquarters. Let's give a brief example. This is a Dutch ground unit. This one cannot be activated by the American headquarters, as we have previously mentioned. It can only be activated by a joint headquarters, like this one, the ABDACOM headquarters, which stands for Australian, British, Dutch, American Command. So this one has a range of 12. Therefore, what remains is for this Dutch unit to trace a supply line of up to 12 hexes to the headquarters. This path may be either fully at sea or fully on land, or it may consist of one land segment and one sea segment. So we can see all the three different cases here. This one is fully supplied by a sea supply line. Starting from the headquarters, which is in this one hex, we can trace one hex through C, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this one is within the headquarters range and follows a valid supply line. Also, this one is fully traced by land. So this ground unit is in supply because it is located just next to the ABDA headquarters, just one hex distance. And now let's check this one unit, which is deep in Australian territory. We have to trace a line again from the headquarters, and this will be 1, 2, 3, 4. And for this reason, I have created some custom-made counters to help you with this. And this one would be the 10th hex. So we include the hex the unit is located in as the final hex, but we do not include the starting point. Now, this particular supply line consists of one C segment and then a land segment from the port of Broome to hex 2427. So what are the restrictions? The restrictions are that you may only switch once from sea to land or vice versa at a friendly port, not including, of course, the port the headquarters is located in, or possibly the port the unit is located in. So in this case, we trace the supply line through sea and we switch to land once at the port of Broome, and then we continue overland. So this is legal. Another restriction is that when crossing sea hex sides, and in this case we do not mean the hex itself, we mean the hex side. So if you notice closely, you will see that some hex sides are fully C, which is these white lines. They are located between two C hexes. Some ones are fully land hex sides, like this one. This is between two land areas. And some are partly land hex sides and partly C hex sides. So this one, for example, divides not only these land areas, but also these C areas. So when crossing C hex sides, the supply line cannot cross a water hex side of an unneutralized enemy zone of influence. Big pause here to talk about zones of influence. Every aircraft or carrier unit, so the units that carry a range, have a zone of influence around them if they are in supply. So this aircraft, assuming it is in supply, has a zone of influence, and the zone of influence always extends up to 2 hexes around it. So we have to consider that all these hexes are within this Japanese air flotilla's zone of influence. So because the aeroplanes of this air flotilla are patrolling around, they can notice the enemy movement in all of these hexes, 2 hexes around it. So this one and this one and this one and this one, all these hexes are within its zone of influence. And if there is no enemy zone of influence intervening, this one is called unneutralized. So, for example, in this case, we've got an airplane here. This is a Dutch airplane, and it is in supply, of course, because it is located together with its headquarters. So this also has a zone of influence, 2 hexes around it. Notice that this does not depend on the unit's range, which might be 3 or 5 for the extended range, but it is always 2 hexes around it. So in each hex that both players have a zone of influence, which is the case for these 2 hexes, because both these airplanes have their zone of influence, this is considered neutralized zone of influence for both players. And where only one player's zone of influence extends, so for example here, this is unneutralized zone of influence. In this case, this one hex is unneutralized Japanese zone of influence, and this one hex is unneutralized Allied zone of influence. So back to our supply restrictions. When crossing water hex sites, you cannot cross such water hex sites if there is an unneutralized enemy ZOI. We will be calling it zone of influence, or ZOI for short, or ZOI. So when tracing the supply, you cannot cross water hex sites of an unneutralized enemy ZOI, which means if this airplane did not exist, this one hex would be unneutralized Japanese ZOI, as well as this one and this one and this one and this one, all these hexes. Now, what does this mean? This means that if you want to supply this Dutch ground unit, your supply line cannot cross this hex side, or possibly this water hex side, or possibly go here and cross this water hex side because there is ZOI, and it would have to find another way. What it can do is cross this land hex side from this hex to this one hex, because enemy ZOIs or ZOIs only restrict you when talking water hex sides. So you can go through land here and then here, and then use this port to switch into C, and then continue your supply line trace to here. So in this case, it would be from the ABDA headquarters 1, 2, and then possibly 3, 4, 5, until reaching this unit and supplying it. When talking land hex sides, like this one or this one for example, the restriction is that it cannot be solely occupied by an enemy unit. So in our previous example, if we want to supply this Dutch guy with this headquarters of ours, if there was a Japanese ground or air or HQ unit here, then the supply line would not be able to trace through this land hex side. So again, you would have to find another way. And in this case, notice that the ABDA headquarters would not be able to supply the Dutch guy, because its options would be to either go through here, through land, which is impossible because of the presence of the Japanese ground unit, or go from sea. The options would be this port, which cannot be reached by land, or this port, which are within the Air Force's unneutralized ZOI, which means you can neither use this port to exit the island because there is ZOI on it, so all the hex sides are considered prohibited, all these water ones. And the same applies for this port of Batavia, because if you want to switch to sea, all these water hex sides are prohibited because of the presence of the Japanese ZOI. So in this case, the ABDA headquarters cannot supply this one. Another restriction regards these hex sides. These ones are unplayable hex sides, which means for purposes of both movement and supply, you cannot cross these ones. There are meant to be steep cliffs or rocks here, and you cannot just land here by sea. You have to go all around and enter the island through the port. Notice that if the Japanese player has moved his guy here and both units are coexisting here, then the supply line can be traced over land and then switch to sea, because the restriction is about land hex sites of hexes solely occupied by enemy unit. So if a battle is about to occur, this hex is not solely occupied by the Japanese, it is jointly occupied, and the supply line may be traced through here. So, summing up, the restrictions are unplayable hex sites, land hex sites of hexes solely occupied by enemy ground, air or HQ units, and water hex sites of an unneutralized enemy zone of influence. However, there is one more and last restriction, which is in cases when the last hex side crossed is a land hex side. Therefore, in case you are tracing a supply line fully over land or tracing into a port and then switching onto ground, the unit has to be within 4 movement points of distance from a supply eligible port. Now let's translate all this. First of all, we have not yet talked about movement, but let's fast forward and do that. When moving your unit over land, a ground unit I mean, each hex has a movement point cost, and there's a beautiful chart denoting all this. These ones are clear hexes, so you have to expend 1 movement point to reach from here to here. We count the cost of the hex you want to enter. So 1 for here, 1 for here, and then possibly 2 if you want to enter this one, because this is jungle, and the cost for jungle terrain is 2 movement points. Also for mixed terrain is 2 movement points, and for mountains it is 3 movement points. Another special rule for movement is that if there is this indication, this is a transport route. So there are roads or railways there that facilitate ground transport. So if both sides of this transport route, which is both these hexes, are either unoccupied or solely occupied by your ground units or air units or HQ, which means there are no ground units or air units or headquarter units in none of these 2 hexes, then you can use these to move at a movement point cost of half a point. So normally from this hex, Rangoon, to this hex, it would be 2 movement points because it is jungle, but because there is a transport route and because in none of these 2 hexes there is a Japanese ground or air or HQ unit, you can move here at a movement cost of half a movement point. So this is particularly useful not only for ground movement but also for supply purposes, because let's remind the rule. If the last hex side when tracing supply is a land hex side, then the unit has to be within 4 movement points from a supply eligible port. By supply eligible port, I mean if a headquarters, any headquarters, be it in supply or not, can trace a legal supply path over land up to 4 movement points or by sea of any length, then this port is supply eligible. Now let's break this down again. We've got the ABDA headquarters, which is located here. Its range is 12, and let's assume that this Air Force does not exist here for now. So we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and reach Rangoon. But even if this was not the case, even if it was further, because this headquarters can trace a legal supply line to Rangoon, so if for example there was the Air Force here and there was ZOY here, and thus the supply path couldn't pass through these hexes and it had to go all the way around, again, because it is a sea path of any length to Rangoon, Rangoon is supply eligible. However, if the Air Forces was here, then there would be Japanese zone of influence here, which means the sea path would not be able to trace to here because these are water hex sites, and because there is enemy unneutralized zone of influence, the supply path would not be able to extend here. So this port would not be supply eligible. It's barely worth mentioning that all these ports are supply eligible because they are also within 4 movement points of land movement from the headquarters. So back to our previous example of supplying this British guy in Australia. This is a supply eligible port because by sea we can trace a supply line to Broome. So this is supply eligible port, and you are within 1 movement point, starting always from the port to the unit. So you can legally use this port to swap into land, and this unit is within 4 movement points, so he's okay. Now let's get into further and more exhausting example to make you fully understand these rules. Okay, another thing worth mentioning is that these 1 units, which as I have mentioned are the long-range bombers, do have their own zone of influence, but they do not neutralize the enemy zone of influence. So these hexes are not neutralized zone of influence, they are Allied zone of influence, but also unneutralized Japanese zone of influence. Just keep that in mind. So we've got this unit here, which is a ground unit, and also this air unit, and we have to check whether it is in supply or not. In this case, it is an easy one because it is within 13 hexes of the Japanese headquarters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's all. Now let's complicate the example a bit. So I will give you a few moments to pause the video and tell me if this ground unit is in supply or not. Ready? Okay, let's go. Answer is it isn't, because if you want to trace it over land, it will stop on these land hex sides because of the presence of the enemy ground units. And if you want to trace it by sea, it would have to go, of course, not this way, because this is an allied ZOI, so you cannot cross this water hex side to here. You would have to go all the way through here, and of course again not through these straits because of the presence of the enemy ZOI, and you would have to take all this long trip around, which of course would be more than 13 hexes. Also, there's a further problem. If we remove this one air unit, then the path traced is of course within the 13 hexes range, and let's denote this to make it easier. But again, there is the allied zone of influence here, which means you cannot cross this one water hex side because there is allied zone of influence all around. Next one problem. Take a few moments to tell me if this air unit, which is located with this American headquarters, is in supply or not. Ready? Okay. The answer is it isn't. Reason being, this is a long-range bomber which has a ZOI itself, but it cannot neutralize the Japanese air unit's own zone of influence. So this is a neutralized zone of influence for the Japanese. So for example, if it was a normal air unit, it would be in supply, and because it would have its own normal zone of influence and would neutralize the Japanese players' zone of influence. And it would also result in this American headquarters, the Central Pacific one, being in supply. But in this case, the headquarters itself isn't. And let's talk about the headquarters supply issues as well. So every headquarters has to trace a line to an ultimate supply source. For the Japanese, it is the cities in Japanese home islands. And by cities, I mean these squares, these red squares. For the Allies, the ultimate supply source is the map edges, which is the western map edge, or the southern map edge, or the eastern map edge. The supply line may switch from land to sea through the use of friendly ports an unlimited amount of times. So for example, if we have to trace supply for this south headquarters, we can go by ground this way and then switch from this port and then reach this port, for example, and then continue through ground and then use this port to exit until we finally reach the home islands of Japan for supply purposes. However, if it is an allied headquarters and it cannot trace a legal supply path towards the eastern map edge, but only towards south or west, then its efficiency rating is reduced by 1. So if there is a whole bunch of Japanese zone of influence here and possibly here and here, now you will notice that in this case, the ABDA headquarters cannot cross these straits here, or these straits here, or these straits here, because it is all unneutralized Japanese zone of influence. So each option is only to trace south or west. In this case, assuming the Americans cannot provide them with ample resources from the east, they lose 1 efficiency rating, which means they can activate 1 less unit during offensives. This applies to joint headquarters and American headquarters. So this does not apply to the Commonwealth headquarters. These ones can trace to west, for example, without losing efficiency because they represent Commonwealth administrative units like British, which can draw their resources from India and their colonies, for example. Now, back to our example. Assuming this one does not exist, this one does not neutralize the Japanese zone of influence. So this is unneutralized zone of influence in Manila. Therefore, the Central Pacific headquarters is out of supply. And with it, this long-range bomber is out of supply. And strangely enough, it does not even have a zone of influence because it is out of supply. Only air forces and carriers in supply have a zone of influence. So we come to a chicken and egg point where the unit itself has to be in supply in order to exert its ZOE, and its ZOE may result in the headquarters and the units being in supply. So how do we solve this? It is simple. First, we assume all units in question have zone of influence, and by assuming they both have zone of influence, we check what happens. In this case, we have already concluded that this one is a neutralized zone of influence, so this one is out of supply. And then we come to the conclusion that this one has no zone of influence. And of course this one has, because it is in range and can't trace a legal supply path through the combined fleet headquarters. So one thing to note is that the offensives procedure is strict in its steps. So first of all, you choose the units to activate, and then you move them in a subsequent step, which means you first indicate, for example, that this unit or this unit will move, and then you move them all. You can't do this trick of activating this unit, for example, and moving it here to provide supply to this unit, and then activate this unit and move them. So the situation is like this. The Dutch cruiser is out of supply. Reason being, there is the unneutralized zone of influence of the Japanese air unit here in Soerabaja, and it cannot be supplied by land because of the presence of this Japanese ground unit. If the Air Force was here, then the zone of influence in Soerabaja would be neutralized, so this would also be in supply. But in this case, as I mentioned, you cannot first move one unit and then provide supply to the other unit so that the second unit can move. Once more, the offensive sequence follows some strictly distinguished steps. First you activate, then you move them and declare battle hexes, and there's a lot of steps in between, but for the most part, it's then the reaction player moving his units to respond to the offensive under the same restrictions that, for example, he first indicates the units to activate and then he moves them. And after that, players conduct battles, and finally they conduct the post-battle movement, which is they move the activated units again to some subsequent final destination. So we are here in the so-called CBI theater, which means China, Burma, and India. So the Japanese army has occupied Rangoon and captured it, and then they have made a successful amphibious assault into Dhaka and have captured Dhaka in northern India. So after that, the Japanese use their activation to activate this one guy and go on and control these hexes. By the way, when units move by ground movement, they also capture control of the hex, and we can use this marker to denote control. So they have reached this hex, which is Impal Kohima in northern India. I would like you to take a few moments and tell me if these Japanese units are in supply or not. Ready? 3, 2, 1. And the answer is, this one is, but this one isn't. Reason being, first of all, a supply line is traced through land to here, Rangoon, so these units are fine. Then it can use one port to switch from land to sea. So from here you can trace 1, 2, 3 more, which makes a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hexes, and reach this unit and supply it. Then in order to reach this Japanese army, you would have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and possibly 8 or 8, and then continue. But this is illegal because you have already used the one port to switch from land to sea. You cannot include more ports. Or you would have to go fully by ground, but this would also be impossible because of the presence of all these Commonwealth units around. So the Japanese would have to destroy one of these units, for example, and then their supply path would again be unhindered toward here. However, there is one more restriction, that this one has to be within 4 movement points of a supply eligible port. But in this case, this is no problem because both Dhaka is a supply eligible port. There is no zone of influence there. so the headquarters can make this port supply eligible, and Rangoon is also supply eligible, and it would be within 4 movement points of this ground unit, because as we have mentioned, this one is half movement point cost. One more half would make 1, and this, although it is a transport route, this one marker denotes that it is yet closed. It has not yet been constructed, so it would be a normal movement cost of 2 for the mixed terrain. So it would be half 1 plus 2 for a total of 3. Now, besides the unit having to be in supply, they have to also be able to trace a line of activation from the headquarters to the unit. What does this mean? Again, we consult the headquarters maximum range, and we have to trace a path to the unit which can switch from land to sea and from sea to land without the need of friendly ports an infinite amount of times, and can cross unplayable hex sites. The only impediment to this is the enemy unneutralized zone of influence when crossing water hex sites, and the presence of enemy ground units solely occupying the hex when crossing land hex sites. So, for example, we've got Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto here, which is the combined Flint headquarters admiral, and he's got a range of 13. So, from the 34 column of hexes, he can practically go 13 hexes to the west if there is no major impediment. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and he can activate this unit. There is no need for this to switch through ports or something like this, so he can just reach it with his range and activated for movement. So practically this is a polygon or a hexagon of a length of 13, and you could even use some markers to remember how far your authority can reach, for example. So diagonally it would reach all the way to here, and then at some point here, for example. So you can use such markers to make your life easier. Anyway, the point is that the rules for activation are much less restrictive than the rules for supply. So you would wonder yourself what the meaning of this all is, since the unit have to be in supply anyway in order to be activated. The answer is, after establishing that the unit is in supply, the easier rules for activations may allow you to choose which headquarters you want to use in order to activate your units. Let's give a brief example. So again, take a few moments to tell me if this Japanese army is in supply. Ready? Let's go. Most of you would answer me that this one is not in supply because you have to trace a line of 13 hexes from this headquarters to the ground unit, and this one would have to switch from sea to land somewhere around here, but there is no port to do that, so this is not in supply. And of course, if we want to go the upper way, then it would take more than 13 hexes, because it is from the 22 column to the 35 column, so it would roughly be 13 hexes towards here, or maybe even more because of this path, and then one more hex to here, so this would not be in supply. And your answer would be correct, unless in this particular example I wanted to kind of trick you. So if you look here, there is another headquarters that can supply the unit in this case with its range of 12. It can reach all the way here and then switch in the port of Hollandia towards here, overland, and the South Seas headquarters makes this army in supply. However, there is a line of activation from the combined fleet to this unit, so they may not be supplied directly by the combined fleet, but they can be activated from the combined fleet, which provides you some flexibility regarding which headquarters to use for your offensive. So possibly you would like to use Yamamoto, the combined fleet headquarters, as your activating one, because first of all it has got a better efficiency rating of 3 compared to the 2 efficiency rating of South Seas, so you can activate one more unit. And besides, because you probably would like to use other units that are within your range, so better located. So for example, you can activate this guy and move him, and at the same time activate some other units that are within the range of the combined fleet, like this carrier or this ground unit, and thus conduct multiple operations in multiple theaters. So this is the purpose for the more flex restrictions on the lines of activation, because otherwise all units activated have to be in supply. And let's not forget to mention what happens to the units that are out of supply at the end of the turn, which is during the attrition phase. This one is very well out of supply because there is an unneutralized allied Zoe around him, and this air force is indeed in supply because it can trace its supply from the Central Pacific headquarters, which is this one. It has a range of 25 and it is in the 58 column, so 58 minus 25, it can reach all the way to the 33 column, and this one is 38, so of course it can supply this air force, so this has Zoe, so this one is out of supply. So at the end of the turn, ground units and air units that are out of supply suffer a one-step reduction. Naval units are okay, they do not suffer any consequences, and so do HQs. However, if a unit was reduced, then we do a different kind of check. If it is within range of any friendly headquarters, whether the headquarters is in or out of supply, and whether this headquarters can activate it or not, it is not reduced any further. This range cannot be blocked by any means. It can cross unplayable hex sites and enemy units and ZOIs. But if it is still not within range of a friendly headquarters, then it is eliminated. So, for purposes of this rule, the range of the headquarters is literally as the crow flies, from hex to hex, up to the headquarters maximum range. It cannot be blocked by any means. So this one is protected from being further reduced or eliminated. So a usual case in the games is that this guy here conducts a kind of amphibious operation in order to occupy this hex of Attu and Kiska, which belongs to American Alaska, which also happened historically, let me inform you. And they are still in range of the combined fleet headquarters. You will notice that this is a range of 13. However, this is not supplied actually, because if you try to trace the supply path, you cannot cross this hex side because it is unplayable. And if you cross this one, you cannot switch here because you have to switch from a port, and then you would have to follow an awkward path here, which would be more than 13 hexes. However, for the purposes of the second check, which is for already reduced units, we just make a 13 hexes range check. And in this case, it is 13 hexes as the crow flies. And this unit is safe from elimination and it will survive the attrition phase. However, there is a certain event which is Operation Vengeance for the Allies, which is the death of Admiral Yamamoto, in which case he is replaced by Admiral Ozawa, and this one has a reduced range of 12 instead of 13, and because this range is exactly 13, in this case this guy will be eliminated. Okay, so in this next example, don't ask me how, but this has happened and the ground units are all spread like this. I would like to ask you if all these units are in supply or not. Ready? Let's go. So the Allied units are all in supply because we've got the SEAC, which is Southeast Asia Command Headquarters, which is a Commonwealth one, and it can activate all these units. And while it cannot trace its supply path through here because there is a ground unit, it can go from sea to Rangoon and then switch to land. And even this one unit, because the last hex site crossed is a land one, it has to be within 4 movement points from the supply eligible port. In this case, Rangoon is supply eligible because there is a supply path that can be made there from the SEAC headquarters. And this is just a half, then 1, then 1.5 movement point cost, because as you will recall, these are transport routes, and when they are either unoccupied or solely occupied by your units, they cost half movement point to enter, both for purposes of movement and supply. However, this one guy is not in supply for the Japanese, because while you can trace an overland supply path to him, he is not within 4 movement points from a supply eligible port, because Rangoon is Allied controlled and Hanoi is more than 4 movement points away, always tracing from the port, which would be 2, 4, and then an additional 2 for a total of 6. However, this Japanese guy is in supply because you can trace a path of 13 hexes through sea directly to him. And because the last hex site crossed is not a land hex site, you don't have the supply eligible port limitation or the overland logistical range limitation as it is termed. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So he's good to go. And the question is, if these guys move here, would this guy still be in supply? You might answer that he isn't, but this would be wrong for the following reason. These hexes are not solely occupied by enemy units, they are jointly occupied. The units are coexisting here from both factions because a battle is about to occur. So the supply path can be traced through these hexes. Next question would be, because again the path from the SEAC would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the last hex site crossed would be a land hex site. The question would be whether this one unit is within 4 movement points from a supply eligible port. And in this case, you may all agree that this one is the only eligible candidate for a supply eligible port, because Calcutta, where the SEAC headquarters is located, has its path blocked because of the presence of this unit. So, is it 4 movement points from Rangoon to Lashio or not, is the question. And the answer is yes, it is within 4 movement points, because for purposes of this check, the supply check, this transport route retains its half movement points cost per hex when there are units from both factions coexisting. I mean, for purposes of movement, this one guy has to expend 2 movement points to go from Lashio to Mandalay. And I know we have not yet mentioned the movement rules in detail, but this is simple. It is a jungle, and because this is not 2 completely empty or solely occupied by you hexes, so you cannot use this transport route to move at a movement point cost of half. This would be 2 movement points. But for purposes of the supply check and overland logistical range check, if there are units from both sides, this still costs half a movement point from hex to hex. So from Rangoon to Lazio, it is still 1.5 movement points, so this one guy is in supply. So in reaction, the allied player could activate this one and expend 2 movement points to react and bring this guy to defend his allies from the Japanese attack. The point is that during the Japanese offensive, you cannot abuse the overland logistical range restriction in order to create battles that lengthen the movement point cost from the supply eligible port to the unit. Before these battles come to a conclusion, these still cost half a movement point for purposes of the supply check, while for purposes of movement, this still costs 2 movement points for this unit to react. So let's move to a particular example that the rulebook provides for some extreme cases of supply situation. Suppose these 3 Japanese air flotillas are here in Batavia and Miri and Singora. So we have to check whether this one particularly is in supply and whether this one, the Malayan Air Force, is in supply. The Japanese have to trace their supply from the south headquarters, and as for the Malayans, they are located with their headquarters in Malaya. So, as for the Japanese, they've got ZOI here and here thanks to this aeroplane, and this one provides its ZOI all the way to here, these hexes. So we apply the same principle again, assuming all the aeroplanes are in supply and have ZOI. If they have ZOI, are they in supply? In this case, yes, this one can trace a path through these hexes because they are neutralized ZOI. Like this, for example, and they can reach the south headquarters. Notice that they could not go this way because this hex is unneutralized ZOI by this Air Force. No Japanese airplane is in a range of 2 hexes from this one hex, so this is the way. In this case, all Japanese airplanes are in supply, and this results in the allied airplane not being in supply, because think about it, in order for this aeroplane to have supply, it has to reach the map edges. It can go all the way to here, but then it cannot move further, neither here nor here, because all these are unneutralized Japanese ZOI. And this way it can reach all the way to Kuala Lumpur, but then Medan or Jitra are unneutralized Japanese ZOI thanks to this airplane. And if you go this way again, you can go all the way to here, and then this one is unneutralized ZOI, and this one too is unneutralized ZOI. So because the Japanese extend their ZOI here, which is unneutralized, and this way to here, all this is unneutralized, so this is a kind of a barrier for the allied ZOI. So in this case, the aeroplane is not in supply because it cannot reach the map edges. Actually, the Malaya headquarters is not in supply because it can't reach the map edges. And the airplane is also out of supply because it cannot trace a line from a headquarter that can activate it. So because Malaya is out of supply, it cannot supply the Air Force. And this is why the Air Force eventually has no ZOI at all, because it is out of supply. So recapping, the headquarters has to trace its supply to the map edge, which it can't. The Air Force has to trace a valid supply line to it from a headquarters that can activate it, which it can't because Malaya is out of supply, and therefore this does not even have a zone of influence. Now let's modify the example a bit, and let's move this air flotilla from Batavia to Cilacap. I think this is the pronunciation in Indonesian. And now we're encountering an extreme case, because if Japanese have zone of influence, then they are in supply. And if they are in supply, this zone of influence cancels the zone of influence of this one, because again it cannot pass through here But if this one has zone of influence, then the Japanese cannot trace supply because they stop right here, because this one is unneutralized zone of influence. So whether this one or this one has a zone of influence, which it will have if it is in supply, will make a big difference, and it will result in the other part not being in supply. So in this particularly rare case, it is assumed that the Allied unit is in supply and has zone of influence, and the Japanese one isn't in supply and has no zone of influence. This is an example that is rarely, if ever, encountered, as the designers themselves state in the rules, and you should not focus on this too much because you will probably never encounter it, but we just mention it for the sake of completion.